The musical world has been greatly saddened by the death at the age of 80 of the conductor Sir Andrew Davies. Across a long and distinguished career, Sir Andrew held positions with such orchestras as the BBC Symphony Orchestra, the Toronto Symphony, and the Melbourne Symphony, as well as posts at Glyndebourne Opera and the Lyric Opera of Chicago. Sir Andrew was also president of the Ralph Vaughan Williams Society. He said it was an honour I feel profoundly. So the Society is devoting this latest online posting to conversations with three people who knew him in different contexts. Sir Nicholas Kenyon recalls Sir Andrew's years with the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Andrew Keener remembers recording a string of works by Vaughan Williams with Sir Andrew and the same orchestra. But first we go back to Sir Andrew's years as a Cambridge undergraduate, when he was organ scholar at King's College in the 1960s. At the time, Sir David Wilcox directed the world-famous choir. Alastair Hume was a member of the choir at this time, going on to be a countertenor in the world-famous King's Singers vocal ensemble. I asked Alastair about Andrew Davies's talents as a musician in those early years.
I think it was pretty clear when he arrived as organ scholar in 1963 that he was a man of tremendous musicianship who was very good with the choir, very good also with the boys, which don't necessarily always go together. And he had, he had the ability to communicate what he wanted, and he had the ability also to indicate what he wanted and to make sure that we did it. So I think one was fairly aware that he was a really good find.
So that means that he was regularly training the choir when Sir David Wilcox wasn't involved himself?
Yes, I wouldn't say it was regularly. It was depended on David's schedule. Sometimes he would get the organ scholar to do stuff, whether it was the morning rehearsal with the boys or taking a full choir practice, happened from time to time.
I would imagine, we'll come on to his legendary sense of humour later, but I imagine he was in his element amongst choir boys, was he, as an outlet for his sense of humour?
I think he just remained about 12 and a half for his whole career, really, pretty well. He was a man who, at worst, sort of twinkled with the eyes, and at best, he was just broadly grinning from ear to ear, because he clearly enjoyed life thoroughly. And this carried through, I think, right through his professional life.
So his skills as an organist, as a keyboard player, they were evident too back in Cambridge days?
They were. He was a very good organist, although apparently he preferred the piano and or the harpsichord to the organ. And indeed, he went on to be the harpsichordist for the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, fairly newly formed in the late 60s. So he did a lot of that. So he was in a way a man of many parts. But I do know that he felt that conducting is what he wanted to do. And so he did 3 years as organ scholar. He then did a Mus.B. at Cambridge, and then went off to Italy for a year. And when he came back, he was sharing a flat with some good friends, Alastair Thompson, one of the original King's Singers. And Alastair remembers him really pretty well all day and every day, involved in studying his scores and honing his conducting technique. And really, he was unbelievably focused on this. So obviously, he had these two things, this wonderful twinkly personality, which was full of bonhomie and fairly juvenile in some ways, but also this unbelievable musical focus. And interestingly, actually, one of the people he studied conducting with was a man called George Hurst. And George Hurst was the conductor of the BBC Northern, as it was in those days, BBC Philharmonic now, when I and Simon Carrington were lowly bass players in it. Actually, Simon rose to be sub-principal, or acting sub-principal, and then when he left, I occupied the seat that he had made warm. but while I was there, of course, it just occurred to me, we used to, the players in the BBC knew the Halle players well. So I used to go across on occasion in depth in the Halle, and playing in the Halle at the time was a cellist called Felicity Vincent. And so I met her there first, and I mean, the occasions when I went in depth were not that often, but we would, have a coffee together, and she was absolutely charming, really lovely. And I assume maybe after that she went to the Toronto Symphony, and I assume maybe it was there that they got together. I can't remember exactly when they got married, Felicity and Andrew, but I think she was quite some person. She was A, a very good cellist in her own right, and B, fulfilling that difficult role of Mrs. Maestro, particularly when the maestro is kind of only just starting out and he's got a big red L plate on his back.
So
I think she did a fantastic job, I think.
yeah, so Felicity, the first of Sir Andrew Davies's three wives.
Three wives, yes, correct.
But just backtracking a little bit, I mean, for people who are not aware of the sort of musical atmosphere in Cambridge, it is the most wonderful place in which to hone your skills a little bit out of the limelight, isn't it? The discipline that's required.
In a way, it was perfect. And during the time that I was there were a lot of people that I had first met in the National Youth Orchestra who gravitated to Cambridge. At the time, there were people like Christopher Hogwood, David Munro, all kinds of really, really good people who were people who, were movers and shakers, who ran chamber orchestras and started early music ensembles, as David did. So you're absolutely right. It was a fantastic place because of the sheer variety of music that was on offer. I mean, I would be asked to play the bass sometimes in a college concert of some sort, and I'd be given a list of 6 rehearsals. And I'd say, I'm terribly sorry, I can literally just do the rehearsal on the day of the concert, because I think there are only 4 of us in the university who used a bow on the double bass. So we tended to be asked to do, quite a lot of things. But you're right. I mean, the music making was phenomenal. It was an extraordinarily high standard. And B, there was just such a lot of it. You could really, dip in and out and take your pick of what you wanted to do. It was fantastic.
So over the decades, finally, Alastair, how often might you bump into him as his career ascended, and indeed as your own career was ascending with the King's Singers?
That's a good question, because in fact it was relatively rare, because obviously he was based in Toronto. I think he did also stuff in Australia. We were also traveling a great deal, as you say. So our paths didn't really cross, though we had this call in 2001 when Andrew was going to be surprised by Michael Aspel and his big red book for This Is Your Life. So Brian Kay and I were asked if we would come along and give some recollections, which we did. I have a nasty feeling we had the temerity to sing You Don't Have to Be a Baby to Cry, because he would have remembered that from Cambridge days. And that's when I told him that I wondered if he remembered the time when a very eminent colleague organist had said to Andrew, well, you'll never get anywhere unless you stand rather closer to the razor than you have been. Andrew, fortunately, remained resolutely, happily, and extraordinarily successfully bearded throughout his career. So that didn't work.
Ah, there's something to remember. Well, thank you very much indeed, Alastair Hume. We're very, very grateful for those memories to be treasured into the future.
Thank you.
Alastair Hume. Next in this Vaughan Williams Society tribute to Sir Andrew Davies, the thoughts of Sir Nicholas Kenyon. He was controller of BBC Radio 3 and the man in charge of the BBC Proms for many of the years, during which Sir Andrew was chief conductor of the BBC Symphony Orchestra from 1989 to 2000. They worked closely together on programming. The memories go back much earlier, though, to Sir Nicholas's pre-BBC days as a highly regarded music journalist and writer.
I first became aware of Andrew Davies when in London for the first time in the early 70s. He was conducting the Philharmonia Orchestra as a young, galvanizing presence. And I remember sitting in those choir seats in the festival hall, listening to him conduct the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, absolutely riveted. I had also had the good luck to meet him at that great meeting place, the Dartington Summer School of Music, where he had conducted and led concerts. And I seem to remember having had a conversation with him on that occasion about if you were going to perform all 6 Bach Brandenburg concertos in a concert, what order should you do them in? It's funny the things one remembers. So there was a connection there, and I followed him avidly across the years when he was making a real impact on our music making.
Well, you mentioned the Berlioz being riveting, at that early stage in his career. I mean, what was riveting about it? What was riveting about his conducting, I wonder?
The energy, the rhythmic drive, and the sheer understanding of what was going on in the orchestra, in that complex piece, being able to clarify the orchestration along with this tremendous drive. And I suppose the thing that became absolutely his trademark, which was this connection with both the orchestra and the audience, and a commitment to smile.
Well, you mentioned audience and smile in the same sentence there, because a lot of people will remember his last night of the proms speeches and the sense of bonhomie and this sort of impish sense of humor that came across. Was that of a piece with the day-to-day Andrew Davies that you worked with, or with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and of course then on the proms themselves?
It was, but I think it's fair to say that this whole last night of the proms aspect of Andrew's work has become somewhat magnified in the wonderful tributes that have been paid to him since he died. And what I would like to stress is that there was this wonderful bonhomie, as you put it. He was always amazingly cheerful and upbeat, but alongside that, he was a total professional. And that professionalism and dedication uh, spanned dealing with the orchestra, but it also spanned dealing with those of us who were helping to put programs together and deliver them. And he was amazingly open-minded and amazingly up for the various things that one might suggest. And he had an elegant way of putting off things that he didn't think were such good ideas without being, particularly rebarbative about it. Let's put it that way.
So you had many a meeting with him to discuss, repertoire planning. Obviously, you've hinted there were some things he wanted to put off. Are you going to tell me what were the pieces that he tended, or the composers perhaps that he tended not to wish to conduct?
No, I won't tell you that. I will say that in taking on the new music that he took on, he always delivered that professionally, whether or not he actually liked it. And I think in that he's in the great tradition of BBC Symphony Orchestra conductors going back to Adrian Boult, who were committed to doing the most adventurous music of their time. And I think his commitment to younger composers was absolutely demonstrated when, in the early years of my relationship with him at the Symphony Orchestra was invited to the Salzburg Festival. And the question was, what should they take? As it happened, they took the Berlioz Fantastique, but they opened with a George Benjamin piece. And when they went to New York, they took the Elliott Carter piece that the BBC, John Drummond had commissioned. So there was a tremendous openness. And just thinking about the Vaughan Williams connection, the very first concert after I went to Radio 3, that was in the autumn of '92, the first symphony orchestra concert at that moment, we, maybe with a little bit of, what's the word, attempt to put a foot in the ground, we reprogrammed and we combined a piece by Steve Martland called Babi Yar with Vaughan Williams's Fourth. And it made a tremendous, tremendous impression and sort of, got the feeling that here was something fresh and new, which we were going to carry forward.
Fascinating. Well, we'll come back to Vaughan Williams in a moment, but just going back to something you said about his sheer professionalism in front of an orchestra, you must have witnessed quite a number of Andrew Davis rehearsals, and I wonder if you could take us inside, one, the technique, just developing what you've already said, but also talk to us about the sort of relationship he had with players, maybe individual players, the way he put himself across in a personal sense.
Yes, I don't think there was anything extraordinary about it. He was just a complete natural. And his whole approach was to enable singers, players, soloists to give of their best. And I think that was why he had such a good relationship with his leaders at the BBC Symphony Orchestra, with, as you say, particular players, but also I think the orchestra as a whole, they never felt that he was pushing them in a direction that they didn't want to go. They felt that he was leading them forward to, create something that they didn't realize that they could create. And I think that is arguably the mark of the greatest conductors.
And his ability to put himself across to amateur singers in the BBC Symphony Chorus, yes, that as well.
Well, that was tremendous. And again, maybe he was slightly in the mold of a past BBC Symphony Orchestra conductor, Malcolm Sargent, in the way of galvanizing amateur forces in the BBC Symphony Chorus, to which he was extremely devoted as a group. And I would say, just thinking back on the proms, three of the most memorable proms that he gave us in successive years, and this was a plan that we hatched very early on, was to do the three Elgar great oratorios. So Dream of Gerontius, Apostles, and The Kingdom in successive years. And to do those with the BBC Symphony Orchestra and Chorus were absolutely galvanizing. I noticed that later on he went on to record some of the rarer, earlier Elgar oratorios, but I'm afraid I could never quite share his enthusiasm for those.
Yeah, okay. Well, we've name-checked several British composers already. His dedication, of course, is much wider than Vaughan Williams, whom we're discussing at this moment. But his dedication to British composers was on the basis of the quality that he perceived. It wasn't a sort of a passive nationalism of some sort about music making.
No, he was absolutely passionate about the music because he believed in it. I do remember one premiere at the Proms where he came off the platform and threw the score down on the ground with the remark that he would never have to see that again. But on the whole, he was willing to take a chance and take things on and deliver them as absolutely best he could. And it was always an enjoyable thing to sit down with him and make programs. There was none of this, one-upmanship about who had done things that maybe he wanted to do or so. He was generous in terms of other conductors who came in and worked alongside him at the Proms, and he always recognized that it was a unique opportunity for the symphony orchestra to have other conductors during the Proms season. But when you think of the consistent support he gave to a whole range of British composers, and Mark Anthony Turnage is another very good example. Composers respected him because of his ability to deliver what they wrote as well as it could be delivered.
Well, let's draw towards Vaughan Williams more fully at last. 4 symphonies that he conducted at the Proms, or the Proms, as I say, is not our sole focus here. The Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis, Toward the Unknown Region twice, Dives in Lazarus, the Serenade to Music a couple of times, Job a couple of times. Did he have a particular feeling for the music of Vaughan Williams? Did you ever talk about that with him?
I think he did have a particular feeling, but as well as those, alongside those live events which you mentioned, Andrew, I think it's also a sign of his commitment to Vaughan Williams that whole Warner Classics set of recordings of the British line were so Vaughan Williams orientated. And that 4th symphony that I mentioned, that must have been the autumn of '92, a very early signal. There were the rarer works that he wanted to revive. I hardly dare say this in the context of the conversation, but I did not know Job when Andrew proposed doing that. And it made a very successful prom in 2002. The Toward the Unknown Region was a natural for the symphony chorus on the last night of the Proms. And that was just one of the many, many ways in which Andrew made the last night of the Proms a really substantial musical event. And it's easy to forget this as well when we just talk about the traditional elements of the second half, although as many people will realize, those were not always traditional elements. But Andrew was very committed to the elements of new music that we had in the last night, and he worked with soloists who he loved. My first last night of the Proms with Andrew in '96 featured Felicity Lott and Anne Murray in a very memorable rendition of the Cats duet, among other things.
Well, yes.
And you know, these were things that he absolutely relished and delivered in a marvelous way.
Yeah. This is not an accusation, Nick, at all, but I will just observe that there, at least at the Proms, there wasn't a Vaughan Williams London Symphony, nor a sea symphony, which you would think that an Andrew Davis sea symphony at the Proms would have been an absolute knockout. As I say, I'm not accusing you of anything, but it's a pity that we didn't hear those.
I think you will find you're absolutely right. There was categorically a sea symphony by Andrew's successor at the Symphony Orchestra, and I have the feeling that Richard Hickox did the London Symphony, but I don't know. If the London Symphony was not there, that's an abject failure on my part, since it was one of the works of Vaughan Williams that I first got to absolutely love when Bolt came and conducted the Halle when I was growing up in Manchester, and that was a very memorable occasion.
Nick, you are forgiven. I'll bet Andrew was with great company in a restaurant as well, was he?
Yes, he relaxed very well, but then he was always relaxed in that sense, and planning programs was a perfectly amiable discussion, and it wasn't as if he was, you know, as many conductors necessarily feel the need to be stressed when going onto the stage and then needing a huge amount of relaxation afterwards. It was all part of the day's work.
Well, Sir Nicholas Kenyon, wonderful memories. Thank you so much for your time. Andrew Davies, hugely missed, but what a legacy we have to savour well into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, let me welcome now one of the most distinguished of all record producers in the field of classical music, Andrew Keener, who worked in the studio with Sir Andrew Davis on recording various Vaughan Williams symphonies. We'll come on to which ones in due course. And Andrew, your memories of him, I mean, let's imagine you in the car on the way to a session with him. What are you most looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to somebody who was, or is, in the time it was, one of the most studio-wise artists, conductors that I've worked with. I suppose it's not surprising, really, because somebody who was at one point very popular and distinguished chief conductor of a radio orchestra, the BBC Symphony, was in the studio quite a lot more than a tremendous amount of other conductors who haven't been conductors of radio orchestras. So he was very session-wise. I always look forward to the fact that, bless him, he trusted his producer, even me, and retakes were very, very, there was never any pushback. The personality, Andrew's personality, was in the studio, as in other contexts, I'm sure, was a wonderful combination of, yes, the first impression people had of him was, of course, very chipper, very enthusiastic. The enthusiasm was infectious, but it ran deeper than that, because it was the enthusiasm of, let me finish this before you judge me. It was the enthusiasm of the amateur. Now, amateur in its purest sense, lover of amateur. He had this was combined with the rigor of a professional who had a tremendous musical ability, quite aside from his musicianship, his musical ability to dissect a score in a way which we would all understand, whether as listeners or whether as, in my case, producer in the studio, listening, being guided as to what to listen for to realize his vision. These two sides of his personality. On the one hand, people who met him first thought, what an enthusiastic chap, lovely. But there was a rigor behind it. And that rigor could switch to having this instant rapport with choirs. And not all conductors are equally popular or can tailor their musicianship and their technique in rehearsal equally to choirs and orchestras. I mean, looking back in decades, Sargent was loved by choirs. I think it's fair to say this very fine conductor, I think, was more or less hated by orchestras. Andrew had the ability to relate to everybody in the professional situation.
So I think we're talking about the C Symphony, which was one of the symphonies
yes,
recorded with him.
Yes.
Can you remember just how he related to the chorus in the way that you're suggesting he could?
There was a bonhomie there. He expected the best. It's interesting. I remember it wasn't in a C Symphony, but there was one moment in one of the symphonies, I think it was the Pastoral, and we were doing a retake in one of the most tender bits, that marvelous climb towards where the soprano comes back at the end, which always breaks the heart. And we started on a retake of that because it was St. Augustine's Kilburn, and there were interruptions from traffic and everything, as is the wont in that place. So we had several goes at this, and on the third go, he started, and the geniality suddenly evaporated. So it says piano, play piano. No one would. If that's a piano, I've forgotten what his analogy was. Flying Dutchman, I don't know. Suddenly he could change without any ill will being engendered, from being that genial enabler to suddenly, when it was necessary, to bring down the scimitar of authority. With a C Symphony, which we did in Blackheath, I remember, I've done 4 cycles of the Vaughan Williams symphonies, and 4.5, half with Andrew when I took over from the late lamented Christopher Palmer, who produced the other half of them before he died. And I remember in Blackheath, I thought, I must learn from the first time I recorded this piece, which was with the late lamented Vernon Handley in Liverpool. And on those sessions, I put the choir behind the orchestra, like in the concert position, and realized in a hall, which in those days in the Philharmonic Hall was quite shallow, the depth of field, honestly, the front row of the chorus was quite near to the trombones, the heavy artillery, if you like. And so if we wanted more choir, we had to drag in more trombones in the mix. And it was very difficult to separate the two. So with Andrew, I suggested to him that we have for a C Symphony in Blackheath, that we have the choir behind him, facing the orchestra. And Ultimate Pro, in those days, early digital days, well, early-ish digital days, I don't think I'm talking rubbish. If one wanted a monitor, a monitor screen, so that the choir could see the front of the conductor, there will be a digital delay. So you'd hear downbeat, pong, and you'd see the downbeat a fraction later. Useless. I mean, really, that's, you know, the ensemble would be even more awry than if the screen hadn't been there. And so with the choir behind Andrew, he quite agreed, like the sport he was, to turn around and conduct the choir, which is quite a multitasking thing when you've got an orchestra behind you, or rather in front of you, and a choir behind you. This was one aspect of his professionalism among many.
So that was the BBC Symphony Chorus that we're talking about there. That
Yes.
was in
Yes.
performance. Yeah. Well, look, you've mentioned two of the symphonies that you recorded with Sir Andrew, the Sea Symphony and the Pastoral Symphony. There's also Sinfonia Antarctica and the final, the Ninth Symphony. I mean, we've got such a range of styles and sensibilities there. And I mean, is it a silly question to ask, you know, which of those and Sir Andrew actually seemed most at home in?
There are no silly questions, Andrew. What a lot of Andrews there are. But it's a difficult question. It's music he understood, and I never felt the thing with Andrew in British music, well, any music he conducted, but the thing with him in British music was that you felt there was this sounds so bland, there was an essential and complete rightness about his approach, understanding. His recording of the Elgar's Second Symphony, which I didn't produce, it's a wonderful recording. Nobody builds and releases that climax towards the end of the finale like him. It's quite shattering. And so of the Vaughan Williams symphonies, one thing that impressed me about the Ninth, I mean, that was always the Cinderella until recently of the Ninth Symphonies. People didn't understand it. The critics didn't understand it when it first came out. Sargent gave the first performance and got very much maligned for it. I think slightly, if the recording is to be believed, slightly unfairly. But nevertheless, the symphony was quite a mystery. Right, I remember Trevor Harvey reviewing Bolt's last recording of it in the gramophone in the late 60s, early mid-60s, saying that he wondered whether even Bolt quite loved it, quite understood it. And with Andrew, one felt that he'd come to it without any preconceptions, and the thing really, really works. I think of, I mustn't be invidious. I mean, I've recorded this piece with 4 other conductors, and they're all marvelous in their way. But I think with Andrew, you felt there was an essential rightness, no preconception about that this is a difficult work, this is a difficult Cinderella. Where was he going with the Ninth Symphony, Vaughan Williams? That makes his performance of the Ninth, I think, one of the most successful of the set, whether produced by me or by Christopher.
I'm just looking here at the sleeve note for the Sinfonia Antarctica, and I'm looking in vain for the name of the organist in the landscape movement. But I think there's a tale behind that, isn't there?
Well, yes, I'm surprised that he's not credited because it's Andrew. Afterwards, we overdubbed the organ with him playing on the organ of the King's College Chapel in Cambridge. And of course, there was a Cambridge man, and why not? I mean, I think I think right to the end of his career, he was still a very capable keyboard player, whether it be piano or organ. Which again, it's not essential for a conductor to play a keyboard instrument well, but it gave him an insight into, working with singers, I suppose. When you're playing the piano for singers, which I'm sure he did in rehearsal, you know how to breathe with them, which translates to how you conduct for them.
You know, Andrew, I wouldn't dream of asking you to choose between the 4.5 Vaughan Williams symphony cycles that you've actually produced, but perhaps you can nonetheless give us an idea of, where Andrew's set stands within that group of 5, and what does it stand for, do you think?
You're right, I'm not going to tell you which. I think the thing about Andrew's performances of all music, but especially this music, which was very, very close to his heart, is that one felt that this, I think I mentioned, there was an essential rightness, which perhaps more than other performances, certain other performances, and I'm not including any ones I produced in that, or am I? I'm not talking about them. Stand the test of time. I think when we listen to them in another, well, not me, because I won't be around in 50 years' time, nor might you. But I think if the world isn't a heap of graphite by then, people will be listening to them and still thinking, this is what the music is about. This is what it means, and nothing is getting in the way of it. I think that's what's special about this cycle.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much indeed for all those many insights into those recording sessions. We shall miss Sir Andrew and his music making long into the future, but we have so many wonderful recordings that you've touched on beyond Vaughan Williams that will still warm our hearts going forward. So thanks for your time. A sad time of the demise of Sir Andrew Davies, but great to share those memories and to remember the great times.
It was. Thanks, Andrew.